You've heard the phrase your whole life, slow as molasses. It's the go-to comparison for the slowest thing imaginable. So here's something that should be impossible. On a January afternoon in 1919, a wave of molasses came roaring through a Boston neighborhood at 35 miles an hour. A 25-foot wall of sticky brown syrup, moving faster than you can sprint, crushing buildings and swallowing people whole. By the time it stopped, 21 people were dead and 150 were injured. It sounds like a cartoon. It was one of the deadliest and strangest disasters in American history, and the worst part is, it never should have happened at all. To understand this, picture the scene. It's the north end of Boston, a crowded, bustling, working-class immigrant neighborhood packed with brick tenements, kids playing in the streets, and an elevated railway rattling overhead. And looming over all of it, right on the waterfront, was a monster. An enormous steel storage tank, about 50 feet tall, that held 2.3 million gallons of molasses. 2.3 million gallons. It stood there like an industrial giant in the middle of everyone's daily life, and almost nobody thought twice about it. They should have. Now, why would anyone store 2 million gallons of molasses in the middle of a city? Money. It turns out molasses wasn't just for baking. It could be fermented into industrial alcohol, and industrial alcohol was used to make explosives. World War I had just ended, and there'd been booming demand for it. On top of that, molasses made rum, and Prohibition was about to slam the door on alcohol sales for good. So the company that owned the tank was in a frantic hurry to process as much molasses as humanly possible before the money dried up. And when a company is in a frantic hurry, safety tends to become an afterthought. And here's where it goes from tragedy to outrage. That giant tank was a disaster from the very first day it was filled. It had been thrown up quickly and cheaply, and it was never properly tested. They never even filled it with water to check for leaks, which was the standard, obvious thing to do. And leak it did. From day one, molasses oozed out of its seams so badly that neighborhood kids would go collect the drippings in cans. The company's response to a 50-foot tank visibly leaking in a crowded neighborhood, they painted it brown, not to fix it, just to hide the leaks. People reported hearing it groan and rumble. The warnings were impossible to miss. Everyone missed them anyway. January 15, 1919. It was an unusually warm day for a Boston winter. The temperature had jumped, and that warmth may have been the final straw, raising the pressure inside the overfull tank. A little after 12:30 in the afternoon, with people out on their lunch breaks, it happened. Witnesses said they heard a sound like machine gun fire. That was the steel rivets popping out of the tank one after another, firing off like bullets. And then, with a deep rumbling roar, the entire tank tore itself apart and unleashed everything it was holding onto the streets below. What came next defied belief. A wave of molasses somewhere between 25 and 40 feet high surged out into the neighborhood at an estimated 35 miles per hour. Think about that. This is a substance we use as the very definition of slow, moving faster than a car in a city. There was no outrunning it. The sheer weight and force of 2.5 million gallons of syrup hit the north end like a liquid avalanche, and everything and everyone in its path was simply swept up and carried away in a suffocating brown tide. The wave was strong enough to snap the steel supports of the elevated railway and nearly send a train plunging into the street. It picked up a firehouse and shoved it off its foundation, trapping the firefighters inside. It smashed brick buildings into splinters, flipped wagons, and flattened everything in a wide swath of the neighborhood. Horses, a common sight on the streets back then, were caught and mired in the molasses, unable to move. In a matter of seconds, a normal city block had been turned into a crushed, sticky, brown wasteland. And then came the most nightmarish part of all, the rescue, because molasses is not water. Survivors and victims were trapped in a thick, waist-deep, clinging brown sludge that made it almost impossible to move, like being caught in wet cement. And it was a cold January day, so the molasses steadily thickened and hardened, gripping people tighter by the minute. Rescuers who waded in to help immediately got stuck themselves. Every movement was a struggle. It took 4 exhausting days just to recover all of the bodies, and the injured were coated so thickly in molasses that they were almost unrecognizable. When the molasses finally settled, the scale of it was staggering. 21 people were dead, about 150 were injured, and the cleanup was a monster in its own right. Crews used salt water from the harbor and sand to try to scrub the impossibly sticky mess off of streets, buildings, and rescue workers, and it took weeks of grueling work. The molasses got tracked everywhere in the city, onto trains, into homes, across Boston, and the harbor itself reportedly ran brown for months afterward. The North End was left permanently marked by the day the sky rained syrup. So why was molasses, of all things, so lethal? It comes down to physics. Molasses is what scientists call a very viscous fluid, thick and heavy and resistant to flow. When 2.5 million gallons of it drops out of a tall tank all at once, that thickness and weight give the wave enormous destructive force, like a slow-motion avalanche with the mass of a building behind it. And once it stopped moving, that same thickness became a trap. You can't swim through molasses. You can't easily pull someone out of it. The cold only made it worse. The very slowness we joke about is exactly what made it impossible to escape. Now, when a company kills 21 people with its leaky, poorly built tank, that company really does not want to pay for it. So the owners, United States Industrial Alcohol, came up with a defense. They claimed the tank hadn't failed because it was badly built. It had been blown up by anarchists. A bomb, they insisted. And believe it or not, in 1919, that wasn't a crazy thing to say. This was the era of the Red Scare, with real anarchist groups actually setting off bombs around the country. The company was betting it could hide its own negligence behind the public's very real fear of radicals. It was a cynical, calculated gamble. But this time the truth won. The disaster led to a massive lawsuit, one of the first big class action style cases in Massachusetts history, and it dragged on for years with hundreds of witnesses and a small army of expert engineers. And when it was all over, the ruling was damning. There was no bomb. There were no anarchists. The tank had failed for the boring, preventable reason everyone suspected. It was structurally unsound, badly designed, and never tested. The company was found responsible and forced to pay. And crucially, the case became a landmark that helped push through new laws requiring real engineering oversight and sign-off on big construction projects. Rules meant to make sure a disaster this stupid could never happen again. The Great Molasses Flood slipped into legend. For generations afterward, Bostonians swore that on a hot summer day, you could still catch the faint, sweet smell of molasses rising from the old North End, though that detail is probably more folklore than fact, a story the city liked to tell about its strangest afternoon. Today, a small plaque marks the spot where the tank once stood, a quiet reminder of the 21 people killed by the one disaster nobody can quite believe is real. And every time someone says, "slow as molasses," a few Bostonians can't help but think of the day it moved at 35 miles an hour. So the next time you hear someone say "slow as molasses," you'll know the truth, that under the right, or rather, the very wrong conditions, molasses can move fast enough to level a city block and take 21 lives. The Great Molasses Flood is remembered as a bizarre, almost comical footnote, a punchline of a disaster. But strip away the absurdity, and it's a deadly serious story about what happens when a company cuts every corner it can and gambles with people's lives to save a few dollars. The molasses was the weapon. The real cause was greed. If you like your history strange, true, and told straight, subscribe. We've got a whole world of it. See you in the next one.